there are various strategies that family members can use to help make smooth communication. I mentioned before, like making sure that you're looking at someone with hearing loss while you're talking, because we get a lot of information from watching the mouth move. Even if we can't read lips very well without any sound, it really does help people understand to be able to see you while you're talking.
Welcome to Some Stutter Law, Newfoundland and Labrador's first podcast about living with communication disorders. It is a production of the Communication Collaborative. My name is Greg O'Grady. I am a person who stutters and your host. Some Stutter Law aims to rebuild confidence and hope for people who live with communication differences by dismantling myths, stigma, stereotypes, and barriers. For more information about the Communication Collaborative or this podcast, you can find us at somestutterlaw.ca. If you only get one thing from this podcast, we hope it's this. It's okay to stutter and it's okay to communicate differently. It's not how we communicate that's important, it's the message that's important. Today, Some Stutter Law welcomes Dr. Valerie Freeman. Dr. Freeman is an assistant professor in communication sciences and disorders at Oklahoma State University. She earned her master's and doctorate in linguistics from the University of Washington and then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Indiana University, where she began studying the speech of young cochlear implant users and how listeners react to it. She often asks how much listeners can take more responsibility for achieving smooth communication and equitable social outcomes for people with various communication difficulties. In her Deaf Experience in Deaf Expression DXDX project, she and her students interview deaf and hard of hearing about their experiences with communication, schooling, socializing, and what parents, teachers, and healthcare professionals should know about how their approaches and decisions affect the quality of life of children with hearing loss. Valerie's work hasn't yet dealt with stuttering specifically, and Valerie is not a person who stutters. However, after reviewing some of Valerie's work, her approaches to the responsibility of the listener and getting first-hand lived experiences through interviews can easily be applied to people who stutter. So welcome, Dr. Freeman, to Some Stutter Law, and thank you very much for taking the time to be part of this conversation today. Dr. Freeman, for some of our listeners who may not be familiar with cochlear implants, can you describe what a cochlear implant device is? And are there different types of cochlear implant? And if so, what types and purposes?
Sure. A cochlear implant is an implant, an electronic sort of prosthetic that's implanted into the ear. There's a string of electrodes that are threaded into the cochlea. So if you've seen the anatomy of the inner ear and the middle ear, there's kind of a part that looks like a snail shell. That's the cochlea. And when someone is a good candidate for a cochlear implant, the little hair cells that are all along the inside of the cochlea don't fire. They don't fire in response to sound as they should. And so the message about sound doesn't get from the mechanical part of the ear to the auditory nerve that sends the messages on to the brain. So the string of electrodes that's threaded into the cochlea provides little electrical stimulation, with each electrode corresponding to a range of frequencies. And then those little firings are sent to the auditory nerve, which interprets them as being similar to the firing of those little hair cells. And then the rest of the hearing process goes on to the brain and is interpreted by the brain as sound. So there's that internal part, which is implanted. And there you need a processor, which is implanted into they make a little divot in the back of the skull, kind of behind the ear. And that has a big magnet on it. And then there's the external part that you may see. So it has the microphone and an external processor that kind of snaps on with that magnet. And then there's a part that often sits on the ear just for convenience because it's a good place to hang things, that has the microphone and part of the processor. So then when sound comes in, the microphones pick it up, and through the processors, they transmit, kind of convert that into these electrical signals that the electrodes then fire and continue that kind of electrically stimulated sound.
Are there any like preferred age groups that cochlear implants are more appropriate for, like preschool, school age, adolescent, seniors? Is there an appropriate age, or is it open to whoever wants an implant?
This is a complicated issue. For children who are born deaf, they have no or very minimal access to sound from early on. And if everyone around them speaks to communicate, then they don't have access to language. And our brains need access to language in order to develop language, and it's also closely related to other cognitive development in childhood, which affects all kinds of things, learning and schooling and reading and social development. So if a child is born deaf in a hearing world, to a hearing family, getting a cochlear implant early, as early as about 1 year old, will usually, help in speech and language development. Now, if the child is born in a deaf family where people use sign language, they have access to language, and so their language development and cognitive development are not the same sort of concern. So children who are born deaf, there is a big debate. Many people feel you should not implant infants. You should wait till children are older. But in terms of language development and cognitive development, the greatest benefits are typically seen with very early implantation. Now, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, we have people who have lived their lives with hearing and using speech, and then at some point during adulthood, or even in teens, but they start to lose their hearing. So they had normal language development through speech as children, and so they have that strong basis of language and cognitive development already completed, and then later on lose their hearing. And so these might be great candidates for cochlear implants without the sort of thorny issues that might come into play when discussing getting an implant for children. So in short, any age may be a good time for a cochlear implant, and there are many criteria that come into play for getting the surgery, and there are a lot of factors, and it's not an easy question for either fact or opinion.
I'm wondering, Valerie, are there any risk associated with the procedure of having a cochlear implant?
There are some risks, as there are with any surgery. Overall, they're pretty low. There may be some risk of infection at the site. I'm not an expert on the surgeries themselves, but as far as I'm aware, the incidence rate of complications is fairly low.
Okay, great, good to hear. Now, what is the difference between being deaf and hard of hearing?
Ah, that's a great question. So there's kind of two terms for deafness first. So deaf with a little d, a lowercase d, is used just as referring to a level of hearing loss. So severe to profound deafness, there's a particular cutoff for how much you can hear. And it's just referring to kind of a physical diagnosis. Whereas capital D is a cultural or social affiliation. So deaf world with capital D uses sign language and has kind of their own cultural norms and history, just like any other cultural group. So someone can be diagnosed with deafness, lowercase d, and participate or not participate in deaf culture. And also people who don't have hearing loss can participate in deaf culture through participation in sign language and being a part of the community. And then hearing loss, hearing impairment, hard of hearing, kind of these collection of terms often focus on a lesser degree of hearing loss where you may not identify as deaf or the hearing loss might not be severe. And as with any set of terms, different people might identify with or dislike different terms. In general, hard of hearing is well accepted, whereas hearing impaired, really focuses on the negative, and so isn't preferred by most, although plenty of people don't mind. So just, it can really vary, but I think hard of hearing is a widely accepted, respectful term.
Okay. You are currently doing a lot of great work with the Deaf Experience, Deaf Expression, DXDX project. Let's talk about that for a while. Would you be able to share what you were doing with this study?
Yeah. So I can give you a little bit of history about how I got into this. I started as a linguist. I am a linguist, but I started my training as a linguist in a department that housed our ASL program, our American Sign Language program at the University of Washington. And so I kind of entered this realm from the deaf world side, the deaf culture side, through taking American Sign Language with deaf signers. And then in my postdoc at Indiana, I was looking at the speech of cochlear implant users. So this is kind of the far other end of the spectrum, with sign language on one end and speech and implants on the other. And often these groups have some friction in their ideologies and ways of approaching things, particularly when it comes to what's best for a deaf child. And so kind of having a foot in both sides, helps me to see, first, everyone kind of wants the same thing, we just disagree about approaches. And also there's a whole bunch of people in the middle that don't only sign and don't just use speech, but have their other communication options, and there are hybrid forms, and people try different things throughout their lifetimes. But kind of from each side, there's kind of a piece missing, which was, especially in research, these people in the middle are excluded from research on both ends in most studies, but also information that's available for parents. So most deaf children are born to hearing parents, and those hearing parents may have never encountered a deaf person before, so they don't know what to do. And the information that's available for them, it may include facts about medical outcomes and even education outcomes, reading levels, statistics on how their child will do in school. And usually someone is trying to get them to make a particular decision depending on who they're talking to. But what's missing is things that that parents are really interested in, which is things like, will my child be happy? Will my child make friends at school? Yes, they want them to succeed also, but they also want their child to be happy during the process. And so I thought the kind of information that's missing for parents would come from other parents, other deaf and hard of hearing people who've gone through all the experiences and decisions that they're making and that their children are living through. Kind of the firsthand personal experiences. And the more that I have been interviewing people with this goal in mind, tell me what it's been like, the more it's clear that you can't put any issue on one continuum of opinions or options, that there are many factors involved in every choice. And parents are often told, there's no one right choice, but you find the right choice for your family. And I would say that that also puts a lot of pressure on parents to find the single right choice for them without consensus about what is the best choice. And in fact, many people change the decisions that they make over time. And I think parents should know that's okay. And how, as your child grows up, the things they need and the things they're interested in and the things that will make them happy, the things that will work for them can change, and you don't know when or how. So how do you figure that out? And how do you watch for it as it's happening? And how do you find the resources that you need to kind of continue making decisions that will benefit your child? And some of the best way to find that out is to hear about what other people have done and what's worked and what hasn't worked, and how you figure out if that's going to work for you. So that's the long version of kind of how I came to this project. And what we're doing is interviewing all different types of people with hearing loss. So we have deaf signing adults, some who grew up in a deaf family, some who grew up in a hearing family. We have some older adults with age-related hearing loss or some other adult onset hearing loss, some with cochlear implants, some without. Now we're also interviewing teenagers and middle schoolers. So they're currently living the situations that we're talking about. We're also interviewing their parents. And now we're expanding to kind of everyone else around the sphere of deafness and hearing loss. So that includes audiologists, interpreters, teachers of the deaf, family members, friends, kind of anyone who's involved, to sort of try to get the whole picture of what it's like socially, at school, linguistically, growing up with or coming to later in life to hearing loss and deafness and deaf culture as well.
What do you see as the outcomes of this study?
I've got a student who's working on putting video clips from the interviews into a searchable database. So I would like it to be used by parents, teachers, kind of anyone who's interested, who can sort of search by a bunch of different keywords to find clips that are relevant to their question as they're searching. So if they want to find, they're a parent, they've just discovered their baby is deaf, let's find other parents in the same situation. Now let's see what parents say about how to choose whether to get a cochlear implant or not, or how to, experiences with audiologists or experiences with deaf schools. Kind of any combination of who's talking and what they're talking about. So hopefully that will be rolling out in the next year or so. We'll see.
What do you like during this project, all these interviews down, Valerie? What are some of the challenges around, let's say, self-image emotional concern? What are some of the challenges that these individuals are sharing with you?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. It really varies. Some kind of young adults that we've interviewed, and middle-aged adults too, looking back, have talked about, especially during middle school and high school, being very concerned about how it looks to wear a hearing aid. Some people say they didn't wear their hearing aid in middle school or high school because they didn't want to be different. They didn't want this thing on their ear. And then several of them tell stories about how they go to college and they decided, I can't hear the teacher. I can't understand everything they're saying. And so they put their hearing aid on and then they realized, oh, how silly they were. They were missing so much information, especially in class. As adults, so far it seems that when people had hearing loss in their teens or childhood, that they have this similar story. Sometime in young adulthood, they decide they don't care how it looks. They want to hear everyone and understand what everyone's saying. But it's a real issue for older adults when they're considering, they've had their whole lives with no problem hearing. And then, sometime later in life, they're starting to have trouble. And they don't want to look old by wearing a hearing aid. I talked to my audiologist colleague just the other day who said that the adoption rate for hearing aids after a diagnosis, so after you go to the audiologist and discover your level of hearing loss, and they say you should get hearing aids, the level of adoption is about 25%. So only about a quarter of people who need hearing aids actually get them. And that's people often cite cost as a part of the decision. But he said even in countries with universal health care where cost is not an issue, the adoption rate is similar. So this is really strong for kind of some groups, some age groups or some parts of different populations where they're really concerned about how it looks to have a device on your ear or on your head. But then others, will say that doesn't matter. It gives me this great benefit. And so I just, some people will go around telling everyone what it is. They'll tell people what the cochlear implant is. Or they'll meet new people and they'll say, something like, now just to let you know, I'm hard of hearing, so I might ask you to repeat yourself sometimes, or I might ask you to, turn and look at me so I can see your face because it helps me to understand what you're saying if I can see you. So there's kind of a full range of sort of self-advocacy right up front to kind of insecurity about their hearing loss or about how it looks to wear the device.
Well, yeah, we had a discussion recently about people who stutter, self-identifying as people who stutter. So I'm a person, as you know, in the introduction, I self-identify as a person who stutters. For me, anyhow, Greg O'Grady, that it's sort of I'm open about having a stutter. It also sort of gives me a sense of confidence, a sense of, I guess, freedom, makes me more relaxed. That I can say that I'm not putting a lot of pressure on myself to be a fluent speaker. So is this an issue with a lot of cochlear implants? Like I'm assuming it is like self-identification. And what's the attitude towards it?
Yeah, I think that can vary. That can vary too. That a lot of people do feel the same way about self-identifying up front. This is part of my identity. So they might say, I'm deaf. And they may or may not say anything else about, and so I'm going to sound different, or I might have to ask you to repeat yourself. They may start conversations like that. And some may Okay, I mentioned before, kind of these different terms, people can identify with different terms, and they may feel it's an important part of their identity, or they may want to downplay it and not mention it. And people go through kind of different phases too, where, I mentioned kind of teenage years is a tricky time for figuring those things out, as it is for everyone. But also kind of entering the workforce can be another kind of stage of life where these issues are important to people, because they may feel and they may experience bias or discrimination in hiring, or after they have a job, in getting the accommodations that they need to perform their job well and to communicate with their coworkers. If there's a lack of understanding or a reluctance to provide accommodations, they may have experiences or worry about having them, so that they may decide to try to hide their hearing loss. And it really varies from person to person, but definitely there are plenty of people who self-identify right up front and feel it's an important part of their identity to be deaf or to be hard of hearing. So there's kind of the full range.
Mm-hmm. I mean, listening to your research, doctor, like when I compare cochlear implants to people who stutter as well, there is a variety of differences. Like, for example, I spent so many years being what we call a covert person who stutters. I hid my stuttering because I was just ashamed of it. We in the stuttering community describes stuttering. We use the analogy of an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg, which is the 10%, and analogy was developed by Dr. Joseph Sheehan. The tip of the iceberg is the 10%, the physical component of stuttering, which is that the prolongations, the blocks, the prolonged blocks, and the secondary characteristics are closing of eyes, jerking of the head, things like that. But that's just the 10% is what the listener sees, whereas the other 90% is the emotional component that a listener does not see, which means that's the shame, the embarrassment, sense of alienation, the anger, depression. And if these emotions are not acknowledged or addressed, that can lead to a lot of psychiatric problems in terms of depression, anxiety. So it's similar, and like for the cochlear implants, are there any supports for, let's say, adolescents, adults who have difficulty accepting being hard of hearing,
Mm-hmm.
deaf, like just to adjust to it? Because it may make it easier to accept the need for cochlear implant.
Mm-hmm. There are various support groups. Many of them are local. Some of them are kind of grassroots. Some of them are associations that are kind of formed. Some have kind of an official state sort of association. Um, Others are more informal. There's a bunch of Facebook groups that are great support groups. I I would think that for adults who choose to get a cochlear implant, they have, because it's a surgery, um, they have put a lot of time and thought into it. They've made the decision. So I imagine that for them, that the image, um, part is a bit less. I'm just speculating, because they've made this decision to have this surgery as an adult. Now, the story would be different for children, who, especially if they're implanted very young, they were not a part of the decision. Um, and so they're growing up with it. And so just like kids who have hearing aids, or even older adults who have hearing aids, um, that they, may go through different phases of accepting and rejecting, using it, and how it makes them feel, um, how they identify. I think people can go through phases. I think it's harder for adults to accept, what often feels like a big loss, something that they had, and then losing it and accepting that things have changed and that they're different, and that can be a difficult process. I think that there are some kind of national organizations like the National Association for the Deaf, on kind of the deaf world side of things. And I don't know off the top of my head of national kind of support groups for adult cochlear implant users, but I do know of several Facebook groups because they, one of them got a hold of my, flyer, and one of them participated, and then a bunch more of them in the same group participated. So people often end up forming their own support groups. So those were adults with cochlear implants.
Right.
I think it may be a patchwork, and depending on where you are, you may or may not find the group that you affiliate with. But with the internet, we don't have to be physically located.
So true. I'm wondering.
So I think.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm wondering, Valerie.
I think people can find the support groups that they need, but I can't necessarily tell you where to go to get them.
I'm wondering now, when you were interviewing the various participants of your project, what were some of the successes? Did they talk about successes?
Yeah. We have several great stories from people who, the ones that stand out to me are the ones of change. I think I've mentioned several times, a past phase in someone's life, and then they've made a change, and then things were different. Whether they made the change or their parents made the change for them when they were young. Stories of they went to the deaf school and, things weren't working out for whatever reason. And then they went to a hearing school and everything was better. They made friends. But also the opposite. They started out in a public school and they were trying to use speech in the classroom, and whether they had an implant or a hearing aid or nothing, something wasn't working out. And it may or may not have had to do with their hearing. It may just be, sometimes you need to change schools and you make friends somewhere else. Or stories of, like the ones that really stand out are when the ones that I mentioned before, where as a teenager, I just didn't want to look different, and so I didn't wear my hearing aid. And then I realized what a fool I was when I went to college, and I could suddenly understand everything the teacher was saying, and I realized how much I was missing. But then there are also others where, some were trying to use speech in a device in school, and then they went to college and learned about sign language. So it's not as common of a situation today because we have more resources for children now, but in past generations, there was the deaf school or there was regular school, and, hearing aid maybe not, and nobody knew what to do, and it was hard to communicate with your family and so on. So kids who were deaf in past generations, kind of had maybe two choices, and it might not have worked well. So there are a couple of stories of people who are, I would say they're probably in their 50s now. When they were young, were getting by with reading lips and using a hearing aid, and then they go to college and discover sign language. And there's actually a brother and sister who participated, and one of them jumped into the deaf world and decided to use only sign language from then on out, and hasn't spoken, doesn't use his voice to communicate for many years, whereas he'd grown up being forced to do it that way. Whereas his sister, she benefited a lot from learning sign language with him and through him, and then when she went to college herself. But she, after a few years, decided to get a cochlear implant. So he went deaf world, which at the time was against cochlear implants. And she got a cochlear implant, and they ended up each each being in deaf education in one way or another, but her using speech and him using sign. But they also kind of came back around in later years, that he kind of came around to the idea of a cochlear implant and ended up getting one himself, even though he continues to use only sign language. Whereas she also is adding more and more sign language into her way of communicating. So now she uses both. So they, started out with a very similar experience, went two totally different paths, and kind of came back toward each other, kind of mixing the various options. And, they've changed, both of them have changed their attitudes in different ways over time. But you asked about success. What do you mean by success?
Yeah. Like success, well, as you were saying, Doctor, when you use the examples of the brother and sisters attitude towards cochlear implants, communication. And for me, as a person who stutters, you see, I've taken speech therapy, and I've had years of speech therapy. I have my successes are sort of a hills and valleys throughout life. But I think it all depends. The most important thing is that, as we mentioned in our introduction, it's not how we communicate that's important. It's the message that's important. So I think it's one's attitude towards it. It can be sort of a hard of hearing, can be a really ongoing challenge. But I guess this success is all in one's perception. And the most important
Yeah.
thing is that to not let this communication deficit control your life. That's a key
Yes.
success, you see. And this is what I keep reminding myself as a person who stutters. you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yes. How that's a very good way to define success as kind of how successful the individual feels, um, as part of their identity and a part of their other goals in life. Um, the doctor's version of success, the definition of success, will be, how well they can hear sounds at these levels, and speech, how well they can understand speech at these, tests. An educator's definition of success might be, do they reach grade level in reading skills or something like that. But the parent's definition of success might be, it might be happiness. It might be, can they get a job? It might be, can they get a good job and make good money? Or can they live independently? Can they, find someone that they want to marry or have children? And any of the sort of markers of success that anyone might, have for their children or for themselves. And for the individual, what does success in their life mean to them? Are they happy? Do they have what they want in terms of relationships and occupation and family life, or kind of comfort, whatever they feel is success.
So I mean, as
Certainly.
when all is said and done, it's a quality of life issue.
I think so.
It's quality of life, and people who stutter, we struggle with fluency. We struggle with we have our own definitions of fluency. We have our own definitions of acceptance. So I mean, there's so much challenges. Much like the cochlear implants people, we go through various stages as well. Because my definition of fluency now, when I've always had a severe stutter. And I remember when my worst experience was when I was first, and I wasn't aware of it, how severe my stuttering was, because I used to hide a lot. So when I was in a new environment and someone asked me my name, and I always avoid, well, most stutterers dislike being asked their names, but my secondary response was that if you asked me my name way back then, I would look up at the ceiling and say, with my arm reached out, look now, look now, look now, look now, look now. My name is look now, look now, look now. That's how severe I was. And can you imagine, as a fluent speaker, seeing this commotion there? How you would you a lot of thoughts going through your mind. So it's so much of a challenge, but as we hope that as we get older, and whether or not we decide to take speech therapy or decide to be overt people who stutter, is to try to work with acceptance and just live our lives. And that involves developing personal and professional relationships, careers, things like that. Don't let it impede us. So it's all success, you know. But we goes back to the
Yeah.
individual, and this is not an overnight process. This is where, like, and I'm sure with cochlear implants, it really takes a team to support people like that. I often use the analogy now of we often hear the African proverb, it takes the village to care for a child. It actually takes an interdisciplinary team to care for people who stutter. Social work psychologists,
Sure.
professionals, things like that, you know. And this is where all the support. And I agree. The more I'm a strong advocate of support groups, conferences, things like that. But before I digress too much about stuttering, in your bio, you state that you often ask how such listeners can take more responsibility for achieving smooth communication and equitable social outcomes for people with various communication difficulties. Now, this is quite the wow statement. Would you like to explain that?
Ah, well, you kind of touched on it some already, that you can't do it all by yourself, for one thing. Um, it takes two to communicate, and the person with a communication difficulty is already working really hard to communicate. And if the person they're talking with doesn't have a communication difficulty, how much easier it would be for them to put in a little bit of work to make the communication smooth. So this applies to people with all types of difficulties and also non-native speakers of whatever language you're communicating in. So when an ordinary listener who doesn't know that you have a communication difficulty or doesn't know where you're from, is in a conversation with someone who sounds different in some way, currently they don't really have any tools for helping that communication go smoothly. But if they did, it would be very easy for them to use them. They don't have this same challenge that's occurring in the conversation. Um, and so I think it's really important and also not that hard to kind of give people a little more awareness and a few kind of communication strategies so that even if you're interacting with a stranger, you don't know what their difficulty is, but you see that there's some sort of difficulty. Having a few strategies for helping the conversation go smoothly and being respectful at the same time, I think could really help. It could help everyone involved.
Mm. What do you think are some of the key challenges faced by those with cochlear implants in terms of the public being open? What are some of the key challenges that they face? Stigma is much like stuttering. There's a lot of stigma, discrimination associated with stuttering, and unfortunately, and I hate using the word we because people who stutter have their own lived experiences, but we have similar experiences, but different experiences. We have to respect that. But it's our responsibility to educate, bring awareness and understanding about stuttering. And so I think one of the challenges we face is, and sometimes we are our own worst enemies as well. We don't advocate as much as I feel. I'm talking about Greg here, as I should. And so what do you think are some of the key challenges? that this target group faces?
I think misunderstanding or lack of knowledge in the school system and in work. So of what deaf and hard of hearing people can do, what their abilities are, the the accommodations that they may need. I think a kind of a lack of knowledge in general contributes to discrimination at work and challenges in getting hired and getting promoted once you're working somewhere. I think the biases that people hold are really based on a lack of knowledge. So just in not knowing that when someone has a so-called deaf accent, that it doesn't mean anything about anything other than their hearing. That it doesn't have any relationship whatsoever to intelligence or other abilities. Lots of people don't know what a deaf accent sounds like or what the speech of someone with cochlear implant or a hearing aid or deafness sounds like. And so when they hear someone who sounds a bit different, they don't know why they sound different. But we have kind of an underlying bias of that there is a really, we have this kind of myth that there's a really strong connection between how well someone communicates, rather specifically, how well someone speaks, and intelligence and abilities of all different kinds. So with that underlying bias, when people who don't know much about communication difficulties hear someone who talks a little different, kind of those biases and stereotypes really come to the forefront. And we can't help it other than to have better understanding, just kind of general awareness that, sounding a little different doesn't necessarily mean anything else. When someone stutters, it doesn't mean anything about their intelligence or skills, education, emotional skills, ability, nothing. It doesn't mean anything else. I hope that someday we can do better kind of at a societal level of kind of breaking the links between smooth or fluent or perfect articulation, so-called with air quotes, because I don't mean this, and these sort of myths about other abilities. Those underlie, I would say, most of the challenges that people I'm interviewing are talking about, whether it ends up showing up at work or school or with family, even with doctors. That's the link that I hope we can weaken over time.
During your DXDX project, Valerie, did the word disability come up? Has it ever come up in terms of is hearing impaired, deaf, or having needing a cochlear implant considered a disability? The reason why I'm asking this is within the stuttering community, is stuttering a disability? 50-50. Some consider it is a disability. Some consider it is not a disability. So has the word disability come up with you during your interviews?
I don't know what the proportions are, but there's definitely split views on this too. In the deaf community, in deaf culture, people would maybe lean toward, no, it's not a disability, it's part of my identity. But of course, plenty of people, but they also have to deal with the term disability in the sense of getting the accommodations they need, because the laws that dictate accommodations like interpreters and closed captions, hearing assistive devices, those all fall under laws that talk about disability. So in that sense, the need for accommodations falls under that term, under that umbrella. For hard of hearing, perhaps it would be even, I don't know what the percentages would be in terms of a split, but plenty of people have no trouble, especially with, I would guess, with adult onset hearing loss. They feel it's a disability, especially because if they had good hearing and then lost it, so to speak, that they feel they were able to do a bunch of things before that they are not able to do without assistance or accommodations now. So they may be perfectly fine with the term disability. Whereas others, may feel, I don't want to identify with that. I can do anything. I just need, some extra stuff to be able to do it. So I would say it's also split in both deaf and hard of hearing communities.
Valerie, before I forget now, before we started this conversation, and when we were talking with Dr. Polly Decker and yourself, you had mentioned that you may be able to use the help of some Stutter law to help you with your project. Would you be able to elaborate on this?
Oh, well, I think your colleague Paul suggested that if people were interested, if you know someone with hearing loss or someone who's deaf or a family member, and would like to be interviewed and would like to share your experiences, then you can contact me and we'd be happy to interview you.
And you would be open to family as well? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
What role do you think, Valerie, families, or what support do they need in terms of having a loved one with a cochlear implant?
All kinds. Particularly parents with deaf children. As I mentioned, most deaf children are born to hearing parents, something like 90%. So they don't know what to do. They suddenly have a deaf baby and they have to make decisions about hearing devices, about speech therapy, about what kind of school to go to, about implants. They have to get hearing aids every couple of months. They have all kinds of doctor visits to go to. They need a lot of support, really benefit from support groups of other parents, especially. For older adults, especially when you have had hearing and then lose it, it may be a gradual loss or a more sudden loss. Family members also have, they share a part of the communication burden just by living with someone with hearing loss. You have to repeat yourself more. There are various strategies that family members can use to help make smooth communication. And I mentioned before, like making sure that you're looking at someone with hearing loss while you're talking, because we get a lot of information from watching the mouth move. Even if we can't read lips very well without any sound, it really does help people understand to be able to see you while you're talking. To avoid trying to have important conversations in a very noisy restaurant, or to choose a restaurant or cafe that's quieter in order to have good conversation. There are a bunch of strategies that family and friends can participate in to help with smooth communication for their loved one with hearing loss. And parents and particularly spouses or children of older adults, may have quite a bit of burden in care for parents making these decisions, and for people living with one with hearing loss, having to make these adjustments. I think some of the best supports for that kind of emotional supports are really support groups of others in the same situation. There aren't as many supports provided. say, by a speech therapist or a doctor. They may or may not be aware of support groups, and they may not provide them themselves. Many speech therapists will run a stuttering support group for people who stutter and for their families. Social workers and people at nursing facilities and even speech therapists will lead support groups for people with Parkinson's and their families, either together or separately. But there isn't as much like that for hearing loss. So I think the family often do very well by finding and forming the support groups of people in the same situations themselves.
Valerie, as a researcher, what are some of the challenges that you face? I'm thinking what comes to mind now is money, the M word. Do you have a problem? Do you have a problem accessing grants, funds, or are people coming to say, Valerie, how much money do you need?
Well, that would be nice. I've done pretty well on a shoestring using funding from my college. The College of Arts and Sciences at Oklahoma State has provided a seed grant and community engagement grants and support through various other small funds. And I use courses and credit for students to help on the projects. So I have many students that work just a little bit, just a couple hours a week on the project, for course credit. So I've been able to make it pretty far so far on a shoestring. Funding is pretty tight for large grants in recent years and forever, and even more so for topics that are more on the social side. Social sciences, humanities have much less funding than, say, medical studies. So I'm still working on foundation or federal sort of money to help make the project bigger and more impactful than I can do internally.
We're all struggling for that piece of the funding pie. And sometimes it's dog each dog, But well, I would hope, Valerie, that you have a lot of people who are also advocating on your behalf for funding. Is it just you that's looking for the funding, or do you have a group working with you? In an ideal world,
I have some. Yeah, I have some collaborators, that may be working on their own projects, who can offer good advice and some support. I'm working with some people at Washington University in St. Louis, in Arkansas, and UT Dallas, at University of Texas, Dallas. I have some good connections with some people. It doesn't mean that they're that results in big grants right away. It's a lot of work, and I think my topic here is, it's novel in that people don't tend, many researchers haven't looked at things like the role of the listener. People that fund, organizations that fund work on and for and about communication difficulties are often focused on a clinical application, targeting the difficulty itself. And on the kind of social science side of things, they're less interested in clinical applications and more interested in creating new knowledge with a testable hypothesis. So mine is this project is kind of sitting in between those two areas. So it can be a little bit of a challenge. But if anyone has ideas, I'm all ears, so to speak.
I'm not too sure if you will be able to answer this question, but is there any subsidies available for cochlear implants? Like, as parents, expressed concern about not having sufficient funds. Are there any resources in, I guess, the states, Oklahoma, where they consider the access the funds to purchase an implant?
Yes, fortunately, most insurance companies, the answer in the US is always dependent on insurance for anything medical. But insurance companies are required to cover the cost of surgery for cochlear implants, as long as certain criteria are met that the cochlear implant is considered necessary for understanding speech. They have some kind of medical criteria. And so the cost of the surgery and maintaining the device are covered by insurance. You may still have a deductible to pay every year or whatever, but so the $60,000 to $100,000 that maybe will be covered mostly by insurance. Unfortunately, hearing aids are not. They do not have to be covered, and they are not covered by most insurance, including Medicare. So a pair of hearing aids costs around $6,000, give or take. There are some cheaper ones. So that, and also visits to the audiologist for hearing loss, for hearing health, are also generally not covered. So, in fact, if someone needs and can benefit from a cochlear implant, getting that surgery may be cheaper than trying to continue with hearing aids, which is a very unfortunate situation considering how many people can benefit from hearing aids. So there is much more support just existing by having insurance for cochlear implants than there is for hearing aids.
And this is a challenge that we find with people stutter treatment. I mean, some employers provide coverage for speech therapy, but not that much. And then it's to the challenge for parents and families as to where to find the money to offset treatment, and because treatment can be very expensive. So Valerie, to end now. Well, again, thank you very much for being part of this conversation today. But we will definitely have you back because I haven't asked all my questions. But
All right.
one last question is, how can folks find out more or get involved in your project? And if so, I don't think you may have answered that question, but is it open to outside of the U.S.?
I don't see why not. Sure. The best way to find out more would be to go to our little project website, which is dxdx.okstate.edu. And it has their information about the project and a link to how to contact us if you're interested in participating. Also, when the database is ready to roll out, it will be linked there too, so you can find everything about the project there. And I don't know if I currently have permission to interview minors outside of the US, people under 18. But if people are interested, I will get
it. Okay.
So I'd be happy to add the experiences of Canadians to the project.
Would you mind then, Valerie, writing up a little blurb, and if you feel comfortable, I could post it on our like the Newfoundland Labrador Stuttering Association's website, our Facebook page, my own personal Facebook page, just to help support.
Sure.
Yeah. But I mean, there's
Absolutely.
usually nothing fancy, but just recruiting so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a little blurb. I have some students who love to do social media, so they make little
great
little blurbs that you can post.
Okay, Valerie. Now, is there anything like to say before we close? Any shout outs or anything? Any final words of wisdom for people in need of cochlear implants, or that they should consider? Any shout outs?
I would say in terms of advice, the best thing you can do is to look around for information before making a decision that you have to, or that you're faced with. There are many great resources out there, and you can find them online. It may take a little searching sometimes to find what you're looking for. But considering questions of quality of life is really important. If you're a parent considering decisions that you need to make for your child, also consider, I know parents are thinking about it, but also ask the professionals that you're talking to in helping you make decisions about speech therapy or schooling or whatever. Also ask them those questions that you're interested in about quality of life. Ask them what they know about how kids in their school make friends or get along. Ask them what kind of supports there are. Advocate for your child. Advocate for yourself if you're someone with hearing loss. Mm-hmm. And, don't be afraid to share your story, and don't be afraid to ask other people about theirs. But sometimes the personal experience is one of the best sources of information of mm-hmm. something that you might not have thought of yet. They have already experienced, and you can learn from it before you face it yourself.
I agree wholeheartedly, because by sharing one's story promotes healing in many ways, but also dialogue as well. And I'm amazed, Valerie, how listening to you even more now, how similar stuttering is related to your work as well. So it's quite similar in many ways. So Valerie, again, thank you very much, and so I look forward to receiving your sort of recruitment flyer, and but we'll talk later. Okay.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for having me. These are really interesting things to talk about.
Okay, and we have much more to talk about. So thanks a lot, Valerie.
Some Stutter Love is hosted by Greg O'Grady. It is produced, recorded, and edited by Paul DeDecker, as well as Luca Dinu, who, by the way, wrote this jazzy theme music. Leah Bugden and Alicia Megason command our pages on Instagram and TikTok. Editing assistance was provided by the Labrador Languages Preservation Laboratory, or Labradory, at the Memorial University of Newfoundland. You can listen to or subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor, and Spotify. Video versions of each episode are found on our YouTube page. Some Stutterla is a production of the Communication Collaborative. Thanks for listening.